This is a weird, industrial, concrete jungle we live in. It kind of feels like, it kind of feels like the Earth, a long time ago, decided to shift and become a city full of skyscrapers. And because of the economic change from herding cattle to currency such as dollars and notes and, the invention of credit cards, society has kind of fallen to the industrial era. It's sort of become an era of technology. Some may call it the information age. This is because they have instant access to information. With such inventions as the internet and computers and, so forth, people have leaped forward. They've leaped far and bounds away from what they used to call primitive times, and they still do, because they look back at the past with this unfond mentality, as though because they're creating new things and because they're inventing civilization, they are somehow bettering society. But you've got to ask yourself, is all this materialism, things bought with money and not with love, really making people happy? And are we happier now than when we were before, back in the old days? And I'm not just talking about 50 or 100 years ago. I'm talking in the primitive times, even before the Neolithic age. The Paleolithic era, or simply the hunter-gatherer stage, at least the way I look at it, the way it's romanticized in art and different various movements reflecting the nature of what it was like back then, they call themselves anarcho-primitivists. And I've taken an interest to the philosophy and literature that has been passed down from person to person, author to another author, and those who've learned from one another. And now it's being passed down to me. And I'm conflicted because I've always lived amongst civilization. But part of me, and I think a part of a lot of people nowadays, kind of wants a little more, but at the same time a little less. It doesn't need all these fancy screens surrounding it. The mind, the soul, and the heart. What it really needs is a bit of the good old outdoors, the way it was for thousands and thousands of years. A bit of the good old outdoors, a bit of life, a bit of fresh air, a bit of nature. But not nature living in teepees or in remote cabins in the woods. Life where you have to fend for yourself, be by yourself, where you're truly free. But you can create a tribe if you wish. You can be with the people you like. People who share similar values or genetics or whatever it is that you really care about. People who share a culture and a cultural identity. This all arrives down to wanting to be an animal. Maybe not so much in the physical, literal sense, but in the sense that you want to be free from economics, from capitalism, from all the burdens of government. These sort of things. In a sense, you are an anarchist the same way people thousands of years ago were. Hunter-gatherers. They worked to provide for their tribe, sharing food equally, like in any good old socialist civilization, only without the civilization. Civilization, which was not substituted at the time, because such things, such concepts such as societies or buildings did not exist. Nobody even thought of such things. Was merely a tribe, wandering the wilderness. It was merely a bunch of people being free. And a lot of people want to go back to that state. They just don't have the words in their mouth that they can put forth that comes off as normal or sane. People just seem to think of this as some weird, wild fantasy. But it's a way of life. Anarcho-primitivism is a way of life, and a way of being one with nature and happiness. Nowadays, I think it's pretty fair that we found ourselves caught up, especially those in the Western world, such as Europe, Australia, and the United States, of course, with technology and with materialism. So much so that we're deciding to put such things forth, such materialistic desires forth, desires that didn't exist prior to the spark of civilization, before things like family and friends and social interaction, which develops the cognitive ability in terms of sociality, social skills, and most importantly, getting into higher education, because those more wrapped up in materialistic desires are far less likely to succeed in life. And we know this unless, of course, you're like a computer programmer or a video game designer, because we can take a look at the individuals who spend their time either playing, games or watching films or just browsing the internet due to the availability that information has with the information age or the digital age or whatever you want to call it. We can take a look at these people and realize, well, they're not really contributing to society because a fair amount of them are unemployed. And on top of that, they don't wish to pursue work. That's never a priority for them. They just care to continue in their ways and never improve upon anything. Nor do they have any real skills or aspirations, because they're just the same old person. From day 1 to day 1,000, they're not going to change. It's more fun in games with a little bit of work to pay the bills, but aside from that, they're never going to become inventors. And we pretty much know this. They know this, scientists know this, scholars know this. The problem is nobody's actually going up to these people and telling them, or making a law for that matter, which kind of gets them to interact with society a bit more. Seeing that you live within civilization, you best off making the best of it. Either that, or you abandon civilization, and you do the right thing by doing such a thing. You understand, it's either you have good civilization, or you have no civilization whatsoever. The problem I run into when discussing the topic of civilization and economics is people who debate over which economic system they prefer, whether it be utopian socialism, the kind that Karl Marx pictured originally, the traditional sense of socialism, or a sort of new-aged scientific socialism, the kind that ran rampant in Somalia post-colonial days. And then you got people who just advocate for plain old capitalism or have alternatives to the free market economy. And the problem is, I don't want an economy. See, I'm on a different page here. I'm on a different sphere. Within this realm of people who call themselves rather skeptical of society and skeptical of the government's business and interference with the individual's lives and their freedom and liberty, I arrive into the frame and say, well, really, we don't need all these different systems because we don't need a system. The problem of a system is that it's a government, and the problem of a government is that it's inherently oppressive to its citizens. Whether the government even be good or bad as a government, well, that's debatable because you'd have to judge it as a government. But regardless of it being better than other governments, it's still inherently impressive because, well, what's the point of a government if you're not supposed to follow laws? And if you follow laws, well, in a sense you are being oppressed because you cannot truly exercise your freedom as you would in, say, primitive times, and to use the term primitive as a compliment, not an insult, because those are the times we should return to. Because back in those days, we weren't under all this pressure to be this or that, or we didn't have to follow stupid laws. And there are plenty of stupid laws today and back in the old days. What existed then existed now. Nothing's really changed. A lot of people like to think that's the case, but no. Clearly the government is just as cruel now as it was 50, 100, 1,000 years ago, whatever time you pick. Without a government, there can be no systematic exploitation. This means that individuals can work to the extent they're feeling comfortable with, or just not work whatsoever. Because back in the old days, you would provide for yourself, or maybe your tribe. Nowadays, and for the past few hundred years, people have been pressured into supporting the state as opposed to people they actually care about or themselves. They think that the state, for some reason, is this holy beacon of hope or some kind of refuge for those who are broke and don't have enough money in their pockets, so they take out debt and then they have to pay it back because it's just part of the welfare system. This is troubling. It comes with the complexities of having a state. That's the thing. Without a state, you wouldn't even have these problems. You'd just be living in the wilderness free. Without civilization, or without even teepees, you'd just be living wildly and freely. Because every day you would figure out how to be more and more free. You would feel that would be your philosophy. In fact, you know what? That is your philosophy from now on. The philosophy, principles, and ethics and morality of freedom. So much so, you would give up your shackles and just run off into the woods. And that was most of civilization. When you think about it, the hunter-gatherer stage took up the Homo sapiens species, largest time period in terms of people that lived there, not so much, but in terms of the length of which the period lasted, we were there more than we were here. So in a way, we're currently in the New Age. In fact, you can make the argument that any year within Common Era is indeed the New Age as well, and that we've actually entered it a long, long time ago. If something controls you, and it's clearly not yourself, not your own body, then something is oppressing you inherently. You look at the government and you think, well, I need a smaller government because obviously it's interfering with my life too much. The ideology in favor of interference with the individuals and their rights and to infringe upon them is called statism, and I'm clearly anti-statism. In fact, I'm so much against it that I feel that if there's one ideology holding back society, it's not a religion, it's just this one single belief that for some reason a government should dictate and decide what we do with our lives, to take away our hard earnings and to also force us into labor camps. This has been done many, many times throughout history. It's been done in China, it's been done in the Soviet Union, and it's being done in North Korea today. But apparently people don't learn. They don't learn that big government equals a horrible life and just a reduction of happiness. Because our happiness shouldn't be decided upon by the government. It should be decided upon by ourselves. We are clearly in control of our lives, so why don't we just turn this around? And why do we bend over to the government, a government which is either formed through a direct democracy, a monarchy, a dictatorship, a tyranny, whatever the case may be? It's all wrong, and it cannot work. It cannot work with the people's freedom. Because in order to truly be free and to be away from obvious fascism, which is what it is, it's a form of extreme authoritarianism to control one's life by means of the state, we need to just abolish the concept of a government and state entirely. Because what purpose does it really serve? See, the thing is with civilization is that if we didn't have a government, people would just be killing themselves. And yes, we can agree that's probably the case. I mean, they'd be killing not just themselves. I mean, if you want to kill yourself, that's fine. I'm not going to interfere like the government does. For instance, at least as of I'm recording this, I think suicide is illegal in Singapore and some Islamic countries, but yeah, look, it's some nonsense right there. But what I'm trying to say is, people will be killing one another, people will be raping one another, people will be vandalizing everything, they'll be vandalizing the already pre-established and built civilization. So, you may make that argument against anarchism and say, well, no, we need a government to, well, pretty much keep us all together. I mean, obviously, if there's no government, then there's no community, and thus there cannot be a society. But here's the thing, a government, at least in prehistoric times, was a tribe. In fact, it still is now to many Native Americans or Sub-Saharan Africans who still practice ethnic beliefs. It is. That's essentially their government, just their tribe. They follow the philosophies and moral standing points that they believe in, and they, do it with the tribe. If they don't want to be part of the tribe, then they leave. Because they don't force people to be in the tribe. You get what I'm trying to say. There's no laws, there's just rules, and if you don't follow the rules, then you can get lost and do your own thing in the goddamn wilderness. Essentially, that was olden day government a few hundreds, thousands of years ago, whatever the case. It really is that we've fallen from that, because we made rules not with doctrines or papers or any of that fancy constitutional nonsense. We did it with ourselves, we did it with our brains, we did it because we shared similar values. And that may be an ethnic thing, it may be a religious thing, it may just be a geographical thing depending on which territory you belong to or feel patriotic or nationalistic to your nation. The case is, you don't need a government. You don't need a government whatsoever because you need to abandon civilization altogether. Of course, people got along very well back in the olden days, and by olden days I mean, the Paleolithic area, basically time in which we didn't have civilization or cars or computers well really we didn't even have huts, we didn't have any buildings, we didn't have castles. There were a few ancient West African empires that fought against one another, which was the problem with, how some of the tribalism worked. But neo-tribalism, we've now come to the certain kind of morality. We've seen that, bloodshed does not work for anybody. I mean, clearly we don't need to fight over resources or anything like that. What we need to do is take care of our own tribe and love our own tribe. I mean, just think about this, right? You have all this, well, you had at the time at least. I mean, there's still some occurring in, I believe, Papua, which is part of Papua New Guinea, colonized by Indonesia. But in the old days, right, colonization a few hundred years ago, or even up to like 50 or 60 years ago for some countries, or South Africa, which I think was the last country in Africa to become independent. These countries were dominated by a government that, well, the government didn't exist in a lot of these countries to begin with. They were essentially anarchist societies because we were all anarchists. We were primitive communists in the same sense because we all shared wealth equally. And wealth was cattle. Wealth was things like rocks, because we trade rocks with one another. Well, they did. They trade rocks with one another because that was their currency back in the old days. That was a simple good time. We didn't have all this, what modern capitalism is, which is pretty much eating away at people's happiness and freedom, and, what modern socialism is. So what we have, what they had back there at the time was essentially freedom, until a European colonial government came and started establishing laws that they didn't need. Yes, they were killing each other, in mass quantities, and you can make the argument that colonialism and, imperialism pretty much got people to stop doing that and made them civilized. The thing is, it's up to them to change. It's not up for people to come into their territory and their land and say, well, you gotta follow the laws of our government from a European country. Well, no, we don't need Europe in Africa, and we don't need Africa in Europe. What we need is each individual ethnic group or tribe, or simply nation, if you want to define it that way, to care for their own people, and to take care of their own people and raise them up. Institutional racism and sexism and really just oppression against any demographic or minority group would not exist, or for that matter, majority group. It couldn't exist because there is no government. And clearly people who join a tribe are looking out for their own people. They share a bloodline or a religion or, an ideology, or just a sense and philosophy of thinking. They would not oppress one another, they would take care of one another. It just feels like something's lost in this industrial era. It feels like a bit of sanity, or humanity, or the great outdoors, or just simply wanting to be one with nature. It's all gone. It's all gone because people prefer materialism, and to suck it into commercials and all different kinds of ads. You have to understand that a world without advertising, or a world without screens, or any of that kind of stuff, a world without houses, where you basically sleep underneath the night sky. Well, that seems like a world, a lifestyle, really. Anybody could live happier than their current life. They could live this lifestyle to the extent that they feel comfortable with. If they want civilization, they can have civilization. But my philosophy comes down to a bit of each to their own. If you want civilization, you can have it. If you don't want civilization, that's fine. The problem is that as children, you're pretty much forced into civilization. As a baby, you don't have the choice to live in the wilderness. You don't have the choice to live by yourself or to join a tribe. You have to conform to the normalities that a civilization puts upon you. And that just adds heaps of stress and pressure and anxiety and misery. Now, people say, but what about vaccines? We needed vaccines because, if we didn't have vaccines, we wouldn't have cured smallpox. And that's true, vaccines do work, and in my opinion, since we're living underneath a civilization, for those who do decide to become part of society, or Western society, the second world, the third world, whatever term you're going to use, I do believe that vaccines should be mandatory, because, they help. Aside from what some stupid Republicans think. Yes, we should advance in that category if we're to have a civilization. But smallpox didn't affect the majority of the world. You have to understand that smallpox wasn't really prevalent until people started developing individual societies. And yes, those societies were developed separately, but they were aided by one another. More specifically, the earliest society in Iraq, which aided other civilizations due to the immigration that they took to China and to Egypt and all those other places. And, the case is we don't need any of that to begin with, because we wouldn't be infected with diseases if we just lived life normally. After all, we could say, those animals who are dying from diseases, they need vaccines. Of course they do. It's just that it's going to be a certain amount of time until we get them the vaccines they need. Because at the end of all of this, we're still going to be living in a civilized manner. Not to say that you can't be primitive and civilized, if that makes any sense. The reality is, we don't need to cure these animals in order for them to have a basic life. Yes, the ones infected, but the majority of them, the vast majority, are not. The same that would go with Homo sapiens if they didn't, evolve to the Neolithic age, and to stay in the Paleolithic age. That's the thing. We stepped out of the hunter-gatherer era, and we stepped into something that pretty much made us far less happy, pretty much took away our natural roots, and made us completely different people. And so that's why I have to oppose imperialism and colonialism, because these are simple products of civilization, a civilization that believes it's superior to another. And of course, tribes, they see one another and they say, I'm better than you and you're inferior to me, and, I think we're genetically better, that we have a better culture or whatever it is. Yeah, sure, there's always going to be those people. And I understand that mentality, of course. You see yourself as the best you can be. You like people that are the same as you, and that's completely fine and healthy and normal. Just the thing is when you start engaging in tribal warfare, and when you start colonizing other countries, that's the problem. Or empires, or whatever you want to call it. If we hadn't evolved into those stages, and we had just lived very normal lives, not even with agriculture, just hunting, maybe we even become vegans, we wouldn't hunt animals, we just collect vegetables and fruits and live off of that. That life is the most normal life there is, most organic, most natural, most what human beings are built for sort of lifestyle. Now, I'm aware that we wouldn't exactly have the same culture we would if we didn't evolve. There wouldn't be all the different national identities of Europe and Africa and South America and North America and Oceania and, so forth, Asia. We wouldn't have all these different national identities, but you have to understand that there's such a thing as tribal identity. Different tribes had different identities, and a lot of those ethnic beliefs are still practiced, particularly in the sub-Sahara. We can live with our own culture, just not a kind of culture that creates people who build, that creates people who work. I mean, unless you count gathering for your tribe, in which case, that's the kind of work anybody can do easily, and it's the kind of work we're built for, we're made for, we're genetically designed for. Not many people understand that anymore, which is quite unfortunate. See, I know a lot of people already advocate against the concept of a government and would rather have an anarchist society. They also advocate against capitalism, which is completely fair. The problem is, these are the same people who believe that they should have a civilization, that technology and materialism and consumerism can all just coexist. Well, it can't really with happiness, because back in the old days, in the Paleolithic times, we didn't have that. We had freedom. We had liberty, we had our own wits about us, and we weren't strapped with chains to walls and being pressured to work, I mean, we talk about wage slavery, for instance, right? The fact that nowadays we're just basically slaves because we have to work if we want to get anywhere in life. If we don't work, we're not going to pay our bills, we're not going to get basic stuff done. So the thing is, what's the difference in being a slave, classified by the usual definition of a slave, and a slave now? I mean, we're basically the same thing. People who are slaves and people who are non-slaves, they're both slaves. They're slaves to the government, and they're slaves to capitalism, and they're slaves to all that horrible stuff which shouldn't exist. The only way to truly get rid of this, because, if we were to just have an anarchist society, people would just kill one another, is to join tribes, or, live by ourselves if you don't want to do a tribal thing, but I prefer a tribe so that we can do the whole socialist thing of sharing food that we gather equally, which I think is completely fair and a good thing for society. Well, tribal society, that is, or lack of society. The thing is, if you don't have capitalism within a civilization, well, it's not a civilization. It can't exist then, because it needs capitalism in order to produce or maintain anything. So we need to abandon civilization altogether in order to achieve all these things, which is what I'm saying. A lot of people consider themselves anarcho-communists. I'm with them, just that they need to accept the anarcho-primitivist idea that we, simply an anarchist critique of the roots of civilization. That is the problem, civilization inherently.
I wonder why people don't just give it all up, this whole industrial lifestyle in the city, when they know it's not making them happy. Don't they just get the sudden urge to, rip off their clothes and dive straight deep into a waterfall, or run into a forest and start farming vegetables and planting seeds and, hunting for mushrooms, whatever the case may be, really, with people who want to live that kind of outback, wilderness-inspired life. I mean, it's inspired by the wilderness because the wilderness is the nature which influences your soul. It influences the way you think. Because when we talk about life, when we talk about Earth, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of influence is not that of a city, it's that of nature. Because a city is built by man, while nature, gardens, forests, jungles, deserts, are just naturally, organically created by the Earth. They were there before human beings were there, and they still are. But human beings weren't satisfied with nature, which is sad, it really is, because out of all the species in the world, we're the only species who feels the need to create civilization, to urbanize things. when in reality we don't need that, and nobody ever has. I don't deny that I'm using technology. Clearly I am. But when you're brought up into this sort of habitat, you're adjusted to capitalism and materialism to think it's the norm because it's the normality of civilization, as capitalism is the founder of civilization, because of economics and, having an economy. In ancient times, we didn't have that, and those times were much happier. You still have some indigenous tribes, the ones that keep their ethnic beliefs and culture and traditions intact, and I have a lot of respect for them. But the case is, the vast majority of the world, and especially, Western humanity, don't follow the path of happiness. They follow the path of materialism and capitalism, and it makes them sad and miserable, and they'll never wake up to it. All I'm hoping for is, if people decide to ever traverse the skyscrapers, make sure to also traverse the mountains. At least I hope. I don't know. I don't know.